Okay, now we go into part 3 on this, down the rabbit hole of what we're discussing is if taking some of the descriptions given of Yahweh or the God of the Bible, could you discern that it possibly is describing a dragon? Now, legally, we can throw out some of these, and that's because the description is ambiguous to a point that you're not sure. I guess an example I could give you is whenever he's in the Garden of Eden walking in the cool of the day. You could put that on anything, although it's looked at as being that he showed up as a person or as a man at that point, of course. Something that he never does after that point, and they even say he can't really, and if he did, he would be bigger than all the skies and all of this stuff. It just changes radically, but that's not for the scope of this. The reason I have this picture back up here before we go on to the next ideal is that you wonder if they had depictions of feathered dragons, and we discussed right before we left the last video about how these bottom ones here are even in the Americas. And so due to the idea that this is all connected with a common belief system, one would discern that this happened before the 10,000-year-old crossing of the Amerindians, and perhaps way long before that, that this is something that before recorded history was going on, and it goes back perhaps tens of thousands of years with these fantastical beasts and where to find them. In fact, the one at the top, you wonder, yeah, well, this was going on here and there, and the Scythians had these griffins and all of this stuff going on, right? Well, no, this depiction that's shown up here on the very top is actually a winged serpent that's attacking an ibex, and it's found in Israel. But it's about 1300 BC, so that's before it was Israel and this Canaanite situation. And were the Phoenicians and Canaanites talking about dragons? Sure. In fact, they put them on the prows of their ships. But if I show you that in a picture right now of the way a Phoenician ship was drawn, you'd be like, oh, that's a Viking. In fact, I've used the same picture back and forth between the two, and nobody has discerned it in a couple of my vids on what they made a picture of a Phoenician for, and they've made a picture of a Viking for. There's other reasons for that, we're not really talking about that, but dragon prows on boats. That's there. Where does that all come from? Oh, it's been on a lot of them. You can see that done in a lot of ways. Also, the ancient Sumerians had that on there too. But one of their depictions, everybody says, oh, it looks like a horned chicken. They actually describe it as that. Well, it looks like the head of this thing that's right here, and that actually would be a dragon again. So there are many descriptions of Yahweh in this God here that has a snout more than a regular nose, enhanced nostrils that breathe smoke and flame. Descriptions overall, basically, that we looked at already, and whether he has wings or not, and so on. So this starts to really sound more like a dragon. And hopefully you have an open mind for this, because now we're going to talk about how you could attach livestock, perhaps virgins, and gold to this idea, because this is something that's well known. Now, if we look at ancient stories and go down this rabbit hole that we've been looking at here and talk about ancient stories that are everywhere in the ancient world, you can find these fantastical beasts. One easily that you could see is probably when Perseus has to fight the Kraken, basically, and it has to do with the Pegasus horse and chopping off Medusa's head and so on. And he shows it to her in Clash of the Titans. Probably y'all are familiar with this movie, even if you're not into Greek literature or things at the time. And that is literally a maiden, a virgin, a princess of a king having to be sacrificed to a dragon, kept in a tall tower like in the movie, where he had to be taken there by a buzzard in a bird cage and set there. If you've ever watched the movie, or the older form of the movie, you get this ideal that there's something else going on with that too. That even though it's a sea monster, if you will, sure it is, but is that a sea dragon? Because there are a lot of different kinds of dragons if you get into dragons, and if you've seen any of my videos on dragons, I've gone into it quite a bit. And now there are special dragons like Tiamat, which is a 5-headed dragon, and it's that idea of Hydra and things too, where you've got to kill all the heads, and you've got to do it in a certain amount, in a certain way, or it doesn't work. You chop off one and another grows back, or in some tales you chop off one and two grows back, and here we go, where you're making Hydra. But one look at it here is that these ancient people of the Bible here had to have a giant circus tent for some reason. And that's another thing that just fits with it conspicuously, doesn't it? It's like, you know, hey, if this God can do all of his things and could come up and show up as a 3-inch thing, or this, that, and the other, or just a burning bush, or this, that, and the other, that would probably be a case. There's also a case in the Bible where somebody goes and tries to sneak into there and they get instantly burned to death dead. Whoosh. Like, well, wrong guy walks in the door and you're in trouble. Of course, this just makes it a whole secret place, though, doesn't it? But, hey, and there's the dragon horde is kept within there and so on, too. And he really likes to eat cattle. We made a golden calf for it. Come to find out, he really wanted some veal or sheep or something, huh? Whenever you look at this tale, though, a lot of sacrifice is given to this god, and it even, going back to the nostrils idea, says that he loves the smell of meat cooking and burnt meat and barbecue, that smell of barbecue. That's strange because that's in the Sumerian tale too, right after their Utnapishtim Noah experience, and after he lands, after the same bird situation goes on, they light up a fire and start a burning, and that's what draws the gods back to them, almost like flies to a picnic. But there are millions of sacrifices done eventually in this type of thing, and I don't have to mention the fact that nobody sacrificed a goat in hundreds, if not thousands of years in this situation, so it all comes across as BS. And of course, here they show that back in some of the tales, you can actually find that the altar for this thing had horns on it, and whenever they'd sacrifice it, they'd rub the horns on the altar. And they tried to make this idea of where the horns are in the little corners and points and stuff, and we have found altars that are somewhat like that, or the points are actually the whole corner. But in reality, just before this point, there was a creature, this Moloch and this type of thing, which if you look at it, looks kind of like a dragon too. Just does, it's missing the big outstretched wings, isn't it? It's effectively like a Godzilla type of thing, if you will. And that thing had horns too. Why would you have horns on the altar about a god that didn't have horns? Well, Moses got horns after he went and saw God's rear end at Sinai, and then he came down and they weren't pleased about cows anymore, and they wanted this type of creature. A lot of these things that we're just looking off to the side here as we're walking down this tunnel and getting to a point here. So let's get a good discussion on this. Let's get an example of these type of things. Also, we could talk about the Ark of the Covenant, but I've got another video coming up that's going to have this piece connective to it too. But you can see this war stance here. Well, in this warring idea that's going on, they had like 12,000 of Moses and his army to kill all of these people off. That was what they were told to do to the Midianites. Well, if you look into Herodotus, he says the people of the Medes used to be called Aryans, as well as all the people of this area did, before Media came to them and they changed their name, just the way that Persia had done whenever Perseus had came. So people used to all have one common kind of like what they are, and everybody started dissecting themselves, they talk about in elder times. But let's continue. I can see a lot of cattle here and things here, but there's also a war that's going on. But they wanted 12,000, basically, of these guys to kill off the Midianites. And whenever you have this story that's in here, we can just look at the New Living Testament that goes on, but you can basically use any Bible and you'll get the same idea. And this explicit passage here basically are all exactly the same. And they tell you after murdering every Midianite man and woman, and it tells you after they kill all the Midianites off, they basically are going to decimate them to zero. Total genocide, which is strange. And some people use this same type of passages here talking about how brutal things were, or how it's just, oh, God told him to kill off all these people. I mean, if he wanted everything to be just hunky-dory, he'd just have them scoot over and give them a place, wouldn't he? All these other ideas. So it shows you a lot of falsehoods in all this idea, but it also shows you how brutal the older scriptures really were. But in this idea where they have these, all the men and women get killed off, apparently it didn't happen like that, because just shortly after, there's a dissection of property of people, and some of it ends up going to Yahweh. And it makes very little understanding of how that could happen, because in the idea, what would God have to do with virgins? Really, what would he need for meat and things like that? Now, I know some of y'all can make the connection right now that the people of the church running the church needed food all the time. So whenever people gave food to them, they had some place they were keeping it at, and they were feeding it to God, but really they were pretty much eating it. And a lot of times it even talks about how they took the offal of the cow and then they ate steak, or whatever, if you will. But moving on through, Moses and his men seem to divide that plunder that I'm talking about, and we'll actually see some sacred geometry numbers coming up here and so on. But they give a portion of it to Yahweh. And one part of this strangely includes 32 Midianite women that are all virgins. In fact, in the story here, they say basically that they're to check all of the young girls, and any of them that has not slept with a man, that they keep all of them. And then therefore, because of that, there would be no Midianite women for Midianites anymore, and they're gone. But now they're crossbred into these people here that it's talking about. And these 32 girls it talks about just never show up again. They've just whoosh. So what happens to them? Do they become Vestal virgins? Are they the first nuns? You know, I'm not kidding. You can read the verse yourself here. The quote says, half the plunder was given to the fighting men. So let's go down this little rabbit hole right here. We're going to leave a stake and tie on a string and walk down here. So when we go back, if it vibrates and forks up here, I can easily still walk right back. We won't get lost. Got to keep this going in direction. But it was given to the fighting men, and it totaled 337,500 sheep and goats. And that's a sacred geometry number. But also the portion that they give to Yahweh of 675 is the Lord's share. And if you look at these percentages he's getting, it kind of comes across as odd in a couple of places here. I don't want to go into that and start doing math with y'all and break out a piece of paper here, but again, 36,000 cattle, which is a Sumerian sacred number, and then 72 would be the Lord's share out of that, and then there's a connected to sacred geometry too that we've talked about a lot of times. Now 72 comes out of that 360, and they just show it right here, because I'm sure y'all are probably aware that even if you tried to somehow get exactly 36,000 head of cattle, you wouldn't have 36,000 head of cattle. And if you did shortly, you'd have one less, two less, three less by eating them and so on. Then somebody would have a baby, and it's going to float and all kinds of things, and that's just a BS number, like many of them are. Exaggerations and things people have talked about before, till somebody kind of went, you know, that number has to do with sacred geometry, and so does that one, and zodiacal stuff, and astronomical things, and astrozodiacal theology, and all of these things connect to weird things like that. But let's just continue. So we've got some sheep and the things of Aries. We've got the cattle from Taurus. Then all of a sudden they talk about donkeys are out of here because at this time people didn't have any horses. So that's what we have, 30,500. We've said that number before. And then there's that 61 where the Lord shared. Well, that's actually a percentage out of that too. It's funny how that works that way. Bet if you divide by 12, you get a number like that, like you do in that 72 by 36,000 situation. And it just gets to be multiples and things like that. So they're exaggerations. Like whenever they talk about coming out of Egypt and so on with the Exodus, that would have been over 2 million people easily, not just talking about the warriors, but men and women, younger ages and older ages and things coming out of there. And here's a dramatic weird thing. It took me a while to find somebody that would try to give an accurate number, but found a guy that back in the day did, but I never found out about it. And I don't know. It looks like it's off old VHS stuff, but he was figuring that around about the time of Ramses and so on, and coming into that and the dynasties all the way through there, that there probably would have been about 2.5 to 3.5 million people in all of Egypt. And so if they're just this slave population that's there, how could it actually be that number? Well, that's exaggerated. Just kind of like World War II was and everything, but we're not going to go there. Here we have 16,000, exactly somehow, virgins, of whom which 32 are the Lord's share that we talked about earlier. So here we have the cattle-like situation that the dragon wants, and the virgin girls type situation. And Moses and Eliel, where the priest received the gold from all the military commanders that they had. And so he apparently wants a golden hoard here. And it says, in all the gold that was generals and captains presented as a gift to the Lord. And strangely, it comes out to an amount of 420 pounds. And y'all are probably aware of that. I would venture to say that they put that number there for a reason, but also there's a number real close to this that it probably had a connection to, 432. What do you think about that? We can leave that alone. Are dragons doing higher math? Well, apparently so. They're able to count their horde and all kinds of things that go on here, but you can think of smog in a lot of ways at certain things, but that's just one dragon and one thing that goes on here. But if you take that as a holotype, we're seeing a lot of descriptions that seem to sound like, well, they could go with that. Now, some of this could seem superficial. I totally agree with that. But in that same case, all we're doing is saying, does it look like by descriptions it could be a dragon? And you could say, well, the virgins thing is something else in war and all these people doing that. And be like, okay, so it fits right up with it, but because blah, blah, blah. Okay, how about the fact that he has wings and stuff? Well, that's just trying to put the female thing, okay. How about the fact that he breathes fire? Now, hold on. Now let's reevaluate those first two and figure out that has a little bit of validity. Just going to go with a little bit of validity here on the fact that there's a list of things that all of us agreed at the first of it is describing what a dragon does. In fact, if I was to do those one by one on a game show, we'd never get to the end before people would go, that's a dragon, Jim. So 420 pounds there, but okay, there's a lot of details there to unpack, isn't there? But here we have the whole idea of sheep and things like that. Now, let's mention that for a majority, these dragons actually eat meat. So we'll have that idea, and we can't really get away from that idea. But realistically, what would Yahweh want with gold or virgin? Well, it's something that dragons crave after. In one or two of my series, I talked about how dragons can be people, and then later they write a mythology about themselves of how them and these people here killed off this dragon. Who? These people that did all this. A lot of times along with that, they bring some excessive point of civilization to them and everything else, and then it gets blended into this dragon tales. Woo woo. But 420 pounds of gold, huh? You know, it's an interesting revelation for many cultures that are around, surrounding this, supposedly, that they all also have dragons in their stories and mythologies. But I showed you earlier where in Canaanite lands and the Phoenicians, in the same place where these people hail from, there's a winged dragon that's there. And remember, of the oldest of tales that we have right now, we have Tiamat. And this is an idea of Tiamat. Now this is Tiamat and Marduk, but in their tale, we live on a dragon. In some tales, the dragon is a giant turtle. There are stories where people went to an island, but the island was actually a turtle. There's some people that say the earth is a flat thing on foundations, and that foundations, what are the foundations resting on then? On the back of a gigantic turtle. What's a turtle standing on? And the answer was turtles all the way down. So here we see Marduk, and if you look in his front hand there, he's got Neptune's scepter thing. But wait, it goes down and up. So this is actually a lightning bolt. It's a sky god. You could call it Zeus. Yeah, all of those things. And he shoots a magic arrow. It's like a thunderbolt into Tiamat's throat as she's rearing back and fixing to burn him up, probably. And he shoots it down in her gut and kill her. And then her body is taken to end up making this firmament that holds up the sky. Now, that wouldn't make any sense to anybody because you can see there are stars there, and so what is she, invisible? What the hell's going on with that? Is she a magic invisible dragon? Well, dragons can become invisible somewhat. If you took this thing that he's riding on and this depiction that's going on here, how could it hold up the whole sky? There's something more to this. Well, it's written in the stars. There is a guy about this size in relation to a serpent about this size in Ophiuchus. And then we have Draco, constellation of Hydra, and so on like that. But many of these cultures surrounding this, including the Babylonians, that they went into captivity right before they came back and decided to change face and become a different people and have a different origin story that seems to be really figured on the Sumerian version of it. In fact, in the story, they tell you Abraham was there, so creation all happened there, and then after the flood, he left, started worshiping other gods, and showed up over in this other spot here. There's some places that are in the Bible that people just really want to ignore. Some sentences that they would have to ignore, otherwise it would kind of all fall apart, at least the thing that they're led to believe now versus the way that it looks like it would go down, even if it was the truth. Regardless, it ends up becoming across as not quite, and it surely never ever was. One people went through all this hell. This is, again, a conglomeration of things that happened to different Caucasians at a different time, and sure, the Babylonian captivity and so on, but didn't they even deny they'd ever been in captivity to Jesus in that tale? But yet the story starts out with them in captivity in Egypt and then ends with the Babylonian thing going on, and then, well, strange that they would be able to deny that. Let's continue, though. So, surrounding people all around this worship dragons some way in the past. And they had to do with virgin girls. And we can even find this not only just over there in the ancient Middle East, but far and wide in the old world, but also in the new world whenever we got here. So somehow a lot of these connectives connect in. Of course, we've made connections to who this Quetzalcoatl supposedly was. He was somebody that had a beard and lighter hair and so on in the description of him, whenever the Amerindians that we're talking about don't have any facial hair. It's strange. I heard somebody give a dissertation one time, and the weirdest thing is that it had to have been thousands of years that they ever saw anybody that had facial hair. So why would they have that? still going on in the thing, or was it thousands of years? Now we find out all the dogs from over there are actually from a Viking Scandinavian type people and match the DNA of that. And so when we say, oh, they came down to Lawrence Meadows and they didn't go down through the Americas, perhaps all those little things that look like they went down through the Americas maybe were true. But here's also a tale in where these Aztecs sacrificed virgin girls, and they ended up doing it twice a year to that feather god serpent, twice a year in their 18th month calendar. But you can also find it in Japanese or in the Orient, and this dragon demanded sacrifice of not people, but of two minor deities, children that were supposed to come to power, so they never came to power, because it would be like they were taking their heir to the throne every 7 years. And that's also a conspicuous number that's thrown in there too. So there are many tales that have these connections of it, and perhaps you've heard of George and the Dragon, and you can see the depiction the book's trying to cover over on the left and how giant this dragon is, and that's how we see a lot of the depictions of dragons and how huge they were. And it's almost unbelievable a man could stand up to something like that. But in other depictions, they really aren't that big. Well, they don't have to be that size necessarily to cause a bunch of problems. Look at a snake and how he can kill you and how small he is, or certain species of spider, or perhaps unseen things that back during this time they used to consider it to be some type of demon or so on, which now we have special words for, like germs and so on. But you can see that these pictures of this George and the Dragon idea are showing one where he pulls them up in his claws, and it really looks like a T-Rex with wings or something along that sensation, doesn't it? But in reality, this classic folk tale goes back to something which is a little bit different than that, and it tells of a dragon, which here we see one that's a lot smaller, even smaller than the horse a little bit, but maybe a good foe for the horse, but no foe for the dragon slayer that's here. But he has spots all over his body, and it almost more akins to a butterfly's wing, like we talked about before, or like a dragonfly. They don't really have spots like that, though, do they? But this dragon in that tale, even, which is up in the medieval times, where it was real popular and a real belief of idea of dragons going on, demanded a sheep and a maiden per day, and that's what eventually got to the point of it having to go away. Strangely, that tale comes from North Africa, and people have made the connection, and that's a monitor lizard, or that's this, or that's that, and could be a crocodile and so on. So now we're back to that idea of Leviathan, and suddenly we see pictures that look like, just like the unicorn concept of laying in a maiden's lap, but that's a dragon. I'm certain of it with the descriptions there. Just like they describe the unicorn to people, and then they turn around and they show you the unicorn, and it's actually a rhino with one horn on his head. It's a one-horned rhino. His name is Rhinocornis unicornis, or Rhinocenetes unicornis. Yeah, there's a fish with a spine like that too, and narwhal horns are the thing of a unicorn's. So what is that? That's a sea creature. But in European folklore, this concept constantly goes around, and it has connectives that all of us are familiar with. This virgin, a princess, you've got to save her, quite often for the king himself, and because the lottery has gone to the point that it even had his daughter attached to it, and then somebody drew that lot, and to save her life, they call upon a dragon slayer. It got to the point to where, I guess no return, and you have to do something about it. Is this call to war? Is this one person a vision of the whole group of people that end up having to civil war back against these people that are overruling against them? All the gold and things they've taken from them and all the hoarded up stuff. Maidens are often used as a form of currency, just like they were in the tale that's in your Bible. You don't think dragons are in your Bible? Again, there's a story of Jesus coming down, and Mary lets him down, and he rebukes a set of dragons in a tale that, well, they threw that one out, didn't they? But they left all these other ambiguous descriptions of him in here, and again, what we're looking at is quite often, but not always, he's described as something that you could claim fits under the guise of a dragon. Well, we talked about volcanoes being attached to dragons. Were people ever throwing bodies in volcanoes like you think of Hawaiian people doing and so on with Pele and all this type of stuff? Well, yeah and no. I mean, it seems like the old ancient Canaanites in the area used to take their dead to a lava field that was out there, and that ends up being Gehenna, and the idea of Sheol or hell, and I put these in there. What's strange about that is later, with our ideals we have now on heaven and hell and so on, you wouldn't take your dead and just throw them into there, because that would be an ingesting them into hell. I mean, what? Well, you put these other ones out here in the dais, and the birds take them away, so you choose who goes to heaven and hell. Was that going on? No, it's just a disposal of the body, and it's actually a clean way of doing it, like cremation or doing something, and then ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and they reinter the body. Check that shit out. A lot of ways of looking this stuff, though, but it's hard to believe that we turn around and go, yeah, well, popular currency for God here were people and slaves and virgin girls. But also he wants gold. In fact, quite often that's what appeases God or a dragon, along with cattle. Usually when they show up, they want some cattle to appease them for food and so on. It goes on. Shortly after that, they start acting for gold and riches, and then they want your virgin girls if they like you enough. And it kind of becomes an inbreeding thing. Interbreeding, not inbreeding. But in that same fact, what we have here is people that are migrating in and doing it. And as I've said before, some of these ancient tales, they would just turn around and tell a tale to these people, become part of their people, make this tale that they know about this dragon they defeated. Oh, they got dragon tales all over the place. Yes, they do, don't they? Guess how far and wide these people reached that had these tales. It's an amazing thing whenever you find that. Let's continue down this rabbit hole. So, collecting gold is a stereotype. Everybody knows about dragons. It's popular in media to this day. But it's that way, and it was in ancient world, and consistent trait frowned throughout the world. For instance, typical dragons in Christian folklore would guard a mountain cavern, which is usually real next to a castle, so they're guarding that, or both. Either one of these is filled with treasure. It's the same trope also found thousands of miles away across the globe in classical Chinese mythology, where you have this idea that they have their dragon that does the same type situation. Sure, there's different dragons and cloud dragons and all these type things that goes on. If you look over here, they had that idea too. It's just in a modern form. We've taken a few of them and put them out as like a standout or as a holotype that people think of. But as we said before, there were water dragons and all kinds of things. But he wants treasure. He wants things too. He's hoarding it in his mountain, just to show you that they actually have that in China too. His name actually comes out to being Hidden Treasure Dragon. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Treasure Dragon. So it's not something that's not too far away. And he guards precious jewels. He lives in volcanic mountains usually, and his little rumbling of the mountains and all of that has to do with earthquakes or a volcano that can eventually become active. And now it starts to sound like perhaps before a lot of the tales that we have in a modern day, there was a lot more attachments to an idea of a dragon than there was in the portion that we try to resource off of. Now we're going to go on to the next one here, part 4. It's going to be in your top left-hand corner, but we're going to start talking about these winged, flying, brazen, brass serpents and things and situations that are hooked up into your Bible, but also with other cultures and what that would have to do. And that's a kind of dragon right there we're looking at too. But also it's an idol that shows up in the Bible too. Very interesting. Top left-hand corner. See you there.